All right. Well, Steve, thanks so much for joining us. We are excited to talk to you, and we appreciate your time. I'm just kind of curious. So, I know you've written some other books in the past as well. You have a tremendous history coaching athletes and being involved at a very high level yourself. 401 mile. How does that? I mean, that has to be just a real kick in the pants to get that close. I actually watched you have a video on YouTube of the Prefontaine, and that was an impressive video. But just kind of give us, if you don't mind, I'm sure you've done this 1,000 times now, but if you can give our listeners a little bit of your history and how you got to this point.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're spot on. It is a kick in the pants when you get really close to something. So even decades later, it still stings a little bit.
I don't mean to bring that up as a way to really start this off negatively.
No, but I think it's important because it also, a lot of times it can feel like a negative, but it can be a positive. And maybe this will explain to listeners. So high level athlete. As you mentioned there, I ran a 401 mile in high school. Running was my life. It's all I cared about. Maybe I shouldn't admit it on this podcast, but I did not care about school. I did not care about anything else. Like running and athletics was my focus. And that's why I was going to go to college, so that I could keep running and whatever would allow me to keep doing that. So, but what happened is I ran a 401 mile in high school, and then I never got better. I never broke that 4-minute barrier. I just, stuck there, and it wasn't for lack of trying. And often what we think like, oh, well, that does suck. And it did. It stung for a while. And as I mentioned, it stings right now. But what it did is it put me down this path to actually care and figure out about things that I was interested in. So that started in okay, well, I didn't improve. Why? So let's look at the science of running. Well, let's look at the psychology of performing at a high level and maybe the things that I did wrong or held me back. And it maybe started out of like a little selfish intrigue, but that put me down this path of ultimately helping others, not only in sport, but in a wide variety, which ultimately led me to also write books and do this thing, because I'm like, well, I have this experience, I have this knowledge I've now accumulated. How do I share that out? And that one quote unquote failure really put me from a world where all I cared about was running faster in circles to what is the greater purpose and what is kind of, things that I could contribute in life. So it took me from someone who, again, didn't care about reading or writing or academics to someone who now loves like exploring anything interesting and going on deep dives and reading a lot and talking to people like you guys, so that we can kind of understand and unravel some of these ideas or problems.
Seems like, at least in my experience, that any types of failures, whether it be academically or athletically, provide a great opportunity to, as you said, then learn more about it and then teach it to others. And that's been my experience of, I find the areas that I failed in the most are the areas that I'm best at teaching. And I'm kind of curious, have you seen something similar? And I know you've done quite a bit with coaching very high level athletes as well. Do you find that the failures that you encountered give you more tools and more ammo to be able to then coach those athletes?
Absolutely. I think what it does is failure it makes us vulnerable and exposes us, but in a good, healthy way, I think, often, because what it does is it forces us to kind of think about things that we often take for granted. So for so long, when performance comes easy, and that doesn't matter in terms of academic or athletic or what happened, is we don't even think about it. We don't reflect on it. We're just like, oh yeah, like I'm a math whiz, I just got it, whatever. But whenever we struggle on something, that is often like clears the path almost, where it's like, okay, how do we actually, navigate this, figure it out? And in going through that process ourselves, what happens is we often learn, in a better way, how to teach that to other people, because we've been in those positions. So when they say, I don't get this, or I can't get through this plateau, or I can't make sense of this, we're like, yeah, I got you. I feel you. I've been in that spot before and struggled with the same things. And here's how we get out of it or get on the other side of it.
Yeah, you know what's interesting that you're bringing up, like, so you talked about this kind of pivotal moment in your experience of not reaching this goal that you wanted to reach, but this sent you down the path of curiosity, and you're able to kind of really highlight what that was. Was there a person in your life? Because it sounds like that's kind of what you've started to transition into, and especially as a coach, but you've kind of transitioned into that person to help guide someone from that. Hey, I've found that this was a very frustrating thing, and then you kind of work them through that. Was there someone alongside of you that coached you and guided you through that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And absolutely. I think this is where, whether they're teachers, coaches, leaders, mentors, are so valuable.
Huge.
Because if it was just up to me, I would have just kind of wallowed in that area and been lost. Because I had no idea. I didn't know how to make sense of, I didn't get better or didn't accomplish this dream or goal or what have you. And in my life, those people almost always just happen to be either teachers or coaches. So both in high school and in college and then in grad school, I had some great mentors and great professor who kind of said, and what they do is they often, it's not that they give you the answer. It's that they're on this journey kind of with you and kind of nudging you in the right direction and then giving that perspective. I had this one professor in grad school who I always remembered, told me, one day is like, Steve, like, you're actually capable of understanding this stuff, and you're actually like pretty smart on this stuff. And it was such a, almost small conversation or small point, but in my head, I still carried around this idea from high school where it's like, oh, I was the kid who, I'm smart enough, but like, I'm not going to read the textbook. I'm not going to read the book that's assigned. I'm just going to get by. And here was someone like opening up my perspective of like, if you want to understand this stuff, you can. If you want to write about this stuff, you can. You're capable of it. And sometimes it's just those small moments where someone from the outside provides both perspective and then guidance on how to do these things that often, on our own, we'd never figure out.
That's, I think, one of the really powerful things about the internet. There's of course, a lot of dumpster fire that goes with this, but one of the great things that I've kind of begun to realize is just that aspect of seeing more people struggling and trying to figure it out. And it's a realization that, everyone's trying to figure this out. No one really has everything figured out already. But it gives us this opportunity to then, play this role of whatever position you're in. You can look at someone who's maybe a few steps behind you and kind of pull them up. And I don't want to get too overly flowery here about the possibilities there, but it's an exciting piece of kind of digital technology of we all have this ability to contribute and help teach and guide those who are coming up behind us.
Exactly. And I think this is something that I think about all the time because, as you said, the internet can be a dumpster fire, but it's on us to decide how we want to utilize it.
Yeah.
Right.
So, one of the things I'm very lucky at is I have a decent social media following. Well, it's very easy whenever you get a following to maybe just kind of go to the lowest common denominator and be like, oh, I'm just going to put this out so I get likes, shares, or what have you. But then you're not being intentional on how you use it, right? You want to be, for me, it's about, well, what am I trying to get out of this? What am I trying to convey? And a lot of that is what you just talked about, is being real, like actually helping people, putting positive content out there, interacting with people so that, maybe we can form some sort of those positive relationships or mentorships or what have you, because you never know, how you might be able to help someone. So I think, a lot of times social media, especially on the internet, gets a bad rap, and a lot of it might be deserved, but it's also on us, is if we use things in a positive manner, they can be a great item for good, as you said, in lifting people up and providing some of that insight, instead of thinking that the world is perfect and I'm never going to measure up, or whatever the other signal is.
Yeah, it requires so much intentionality. It reminds me, as I was hearing you speak through that, the thing that I thought of was oftentimes in teaching, we find ourselves teaching to the lowest common denominator, and the students are struggling. We spend more time trying to bring them up, but taking the extra time then to contact the students who are just nailing it, but also connecting with them. And those are, I mean, we can develop some great relationships with some of those students as well. And again, just the theme of intentionality is one that really comes through there. And I love that. That's a good reminder for us as well to, whatever we're putting out there, make sure it's, have a purpose. There should be a purpose behind that, not just platitudes, not just the lowest common denominator. But I think that kind of segues into one of the things I'm very curious to learn about from you, Steve, is, one of the things, I guess, as a preface, one of the things that Levi and I both are maybe later in life discovering is the value and power of writing, just the clarity that brings. And so as someone who's now written several books and been a part of that, what's your process like for writing? What sorts of, maybe to start at the beginning, when did you begin that process of writing, and what got you to realize that was something that you should pursue further?
Yeah, so as listeners will probably realize, is that at the beginning I would say I was a very poor writer. Because it wasn't something that, again, came naturally to me. And I think one of the things that is really important before I describe my process is we often, when we read books or we read newspaper magazines or whatever it is, we see the writing and we forget that that's the finished, polished product. And that a lot of messiness goes into it. And that's how my process is. Like, I got into writing, and as I said, I wasn't very good at it, but to make sense of things is writing provides a way to work through things in kind of systematic, but also messy way so that you can get clarity on it. So I found that my ideas that I was wrestling with, if I wrote about them, I would get better clarity on them. So that's how I kind of started it. As it was, again, kind of a little bit selfish in the sense that let's try and make sense of these things I'm struggling with. And then I found, other people are trying to make sense of them as well. So I might as well just kind of put this stuff out into the world. And as far as my writing process, it always starts with research and a notebook. Meaning, I have these ideas that come across for maybe a book or a long article, and I want to spend time exploring them for a long time before I ever put pen to paper. So I've got, whenever an idea comes out, I've just got a notebook and I just start dumping stuff into it. And that notebook, in this case, in my latest book of Do Hard Things, it was on resilience and toughness. And I'll have 50 pages of just random thoughts and notes and things that I pull from other books I'm reading or research I'm doing or people I'm talking to, going to mentors or experts. And I just dump it all in there. And then after that, then the writing process starts where it's okay, I've got all this information. How do I now get clear on it? And often that is outlining or writing a little bit and then coming back to it. And if you looked at my writing process, I'm the kind of person who likes to dump a lot on the page and then come back and make it succinct or clear or what have you. So I don't worry too much about the first draft. My editor at the publisher I work with will tell you my first drafts are always kind of messy and way too long. And that's okay. That's part of it. It's not the finished product. But over time, I hope to, again, get a little bit more concise, get a little bit more clear, cut things out so that the reader has the message and the experience that I ultimately want.
Yeah. So everything you're saying right now is just resonating so deep with me from I went to school to play sport, not to, to actually learn, to the writing not being your first passion or it's actually something that you struggle with. So this is very interesting. And maybe what's more interesting as an aside is you're a former runner and you're an author. And those are the two hardest things I could think of for me to do, which is running long distance really fast as well as writing. So this is very interesting to me. When you talk about, or as you kind of dive a little bit more into your writing process, do you have a specific routine where it's Mondays, I just need 10 minutes. So I guess, how do you set your guidelines, your rules, and can you talk a little bit more about that as someone myself who wants to also become a better writer, if you will?
Yeah. So what I would say there is I do have a routine. And I'm now fortunate to be able to do that routine consistently.
Mm-hmm.
When I first started writing, I didn't have that opportunity because I was, coaching full time, having multiple things that I was doing. So initially during my first book that I ever wrote, like I was writing on bus trips, as we're going to a track meet or, sitting in the stands. Track meets are often very long. So sitting in the stands, and it's like, oh, I don't have another race to coach for another 2 hours. So I'm going to write here. And I think routines, don't get me wrong, help a lot. But at the very beginning, I was like, I just have to write. And if it's not great, it's not great. If I'm not in the perfect spot, that's okay. I'm just going to try and write stuff in whatever have you. And I think even in my routine now, which is more structured, is I don't try and be perfect. I try and just get stuff down. Yeah. So now my routine is pretty simple. I do my best writing in the mornings. So I get up. I love to exercise, often a run, sometimes other stuff. So the first thing I do is like get my exercise out of the way, get it done. I feel energized. I come back and then I sit down to write. And I either, now that I have some control, I either write at one or two places. As my desk at home, I've got a desk where like my notebooks are right there. My computer is right there. I try to turn off all other distractions. I like throw my phone in the other room. Often turn my Wi-Fi off on my computer because like I'm a human being and distractions are normal. So
YouTube.
YouTube.
It just kills you, right?
Yeah.
So, but that's like, I know that I'm human, so I try and minimize that. And the other thing is I try and like just set aside some time. So if it's an hour, if it's 2 hours, if it's 3 hours, whatever it is, I'm just like, this is my focus time. I'm just trying to get it done. And then I just kind of go to the work. The other place, if I can't get stuff, sometimes I just get in a kind of almost like a block where I'm just like, this sucks. And I sit down and I'm like, I can't get anything to do. That's when I go to like a coffee shop. And often that change of environment, I'll put some headphones in and turn on some music that I've listened to that, 1,000 times so that I'm not distracted by it. And I'll just sit at a coffee shop for a couple hours and just try and work through things. So those are my two, I guess, places that I write at.
Sure. And go.
I was just gonna say, it's interesting that you mentioned the kind of the discipline aspect of writing.
Yeah.
Because, and you mentioned like kind of having a writer's block is a common phrase, but that happens. And, to your point earlier of the importance of just starting, that's one of the things we find ourselves finding, saying over and over and over is just start, do something. And I've heard that very, very many times from very successful writers that, I forget who it was, but somebody was saying, I write best when I have inspiration. And funny enough, that inspiration happens at 7 a.m. every morning. The idea that it's not inspiration, it's I'm doing the discipline.
Yeah.
And things come from that. Go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is where it ties to athletics. If you were an athlete, you had to do the same thing, right? It's like, sometimes I don't feel like going for a run or lift weights or whatever when I was competing, but you're just like, I got to show up even on days where it's like, I don't feel great and I'm low on energy or what have you, or I'm exhausted from studying. You still got to show up. And I think it's the same here. And the other, real kind of tip that I like to give to other writers who might struggle is you don't have to go in order and you don't have to fill it from, beginning to end. Often what happens is if I am stuck on, let's say, a chapter or a section or whatever of a book, I will literally in my Word document write like, here's what I'm thinking, come back later. And then I'll just go to something else where I'm like, you know what, I feel more energized on this section or this chapter, and I'm just going to start writing here. And it's a little haphazard, but what it does is it just keeps that momentum kind of going. Right. And I think that's what it's about is I just got to make progress, even if it's one small step. And if I could do that, then over time, eventually the big project's going to get done.
Adherence.
Yeah, yeah. Do you give yourself kind of, having a publisher and an editor, they're going to give you deadlines, but prior to writing books and as you kind of began to develop this skill, did you give yourself maybe some more structured rules to try to, or maybe you would call them goals. I don't want to make this, too rigid or whatever, but did you give yourself goals and kind of milestones to achieve to mark progress? Did this kind of naturally unfold, or how was that process for you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a very kind of goal-driven person, so that stuff comes very naturally to me.
Yeah.
So absolutely, I would sit down and have goals for, you know what, at the end of X, I want to have 2 chapters done, or
Hmm.
like, in the very beginning, it was like simple stuff like blog posts where I was like,
Hmm.
I'm gonna write 2 blog posts a week and just have it done and do that kind of stuff where it's just like, again, for me, it was about keeping that momentum.
Yeah.
And sometimes I'll be honest, like especially with big projects like book projects, like I'll have those goals, and of course I have deadlines and stuff like that now, but like sometimes the goal gets thrown out and you just got to be okay with it.
Hmm.
I mean, I remember again one of my early books, just I was struggling with it. Is
Hmm.
I was like midway through, it's like you're in that spot where you've got a lot done, but you also have so long to go. And
Yeah.
I remember being like, all right, I'm driving myself nuts. I'm going to step away for a week, not touch this, and then come back and get back on it. And sometimes that's necessary. But again, even there, like when I step back, I make it defined, right?
Mm.
It's be like, I'm stepping back for 1 week or whatever it is, and then I'll get back on it. Because if you don't, it drags on
You
and
start
then
to lose it.
you never
Hmm.
come back.
It's the cheat meal idea. Have one
Yeah.
cheat meal, get back on track.
Yeah. Not a cheat
Exactly.
week.
Yeah.
Yeah. So do you ever, I mean, you've been doing this for a while now. How, if you did, so maybe you didn't, but did you struggle with any kind of like imposter syndrome, or what I have to say doesn't really matter? Who really is going to care about this? And then also the other thought that, these things are rolling around in our heads all day long. So for us, it's normal, or this is a common thing. But when in reality, when you read a book like yours, you go through it, and I'm like, man, I'm blown away at some of this stuff. Do you ever wrestle with those things? And maybe what are some ways that you overcame, if not just start, which seems to be a theme here?
Yeah, start is the best answer I can give, but absolutely. I'll be honest, I still wrestle with
Mm.
imposter syndrome.
Hmm.
Every single new book that I start, I sit down and there is that moment where it's like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
Like,
Which is
what?
probably a good thing, right? It
Yeah,
makes you dive deeper into things and start to peel the onion for sure.
exactly. And it reminds me of, actually, I wrote a little bit about this in this book, with a lesson that I learned from a good friend who then went on to, be a special operator in the military.
Hmm.
Told me, he said, Steve, a little bit of doubt is good because it keeps you sharp.
Yep.
If you don't have doubt, you're not going to be sharp.
Yeah.
And I think the same thing applies here, where that imposter syndrome it keeps you in check, right? It allows me to say, okay, I really got to put my effort into this. And
Hmm.
as far as, getting over that, I don't think you ever do. As I said, I still go through it. But what really helps me is getting clear on, well, why am I writing this and who am I writing it for?
Yeah.
And if I simplify that,
Hmm.
then that often gives me enough, because every book, it's, the temptation is to be like, well, I'm writing this for everybody. Everybody's gonna, buy this. And that, for some, that might be the case. But for me, it really comes down to, I didn't start writing this book, to sell 1 billion copies.
Hmm.
I wrote this book because the topic was interesting. And I thought, you know what? This could help some people.
Hmm.
And if I get clear on, well, what does this mean to help some people, then that like takes away some of that imposter syndrome, because the reality is, if I write this book and 100 people read it, but it really resonates with those
Yeah.
100 people and helps them and changes their perspective or maybe life in a positive manner, then I've done that. Then I've done my job,
Hmm.
so like getting clear on that really, really helps.
Yeah. And not to drill too down on just the writing part. I promise we will transition to the meat here, but it's something that Andrew and I have been talking about quite a bit and have been encouraging people to do. So, going through this book was perfect timing for me. Did you, in starting this writing process, were you someone that journaled, or did you just kind of wake up and go, I want to write a book and I'm going to start, or maybe it was a blog, or did you use a blog as kind of a journal platform for you? Can you talk about how it started a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a big believer in like chewing and wrestling on ideas for a really long time. So even this latest book, Do Hard Things, like I've been thinking about toughness and resilience all the way back to my time as an athlete.
Yeah.
And maybe not officially and all that stuff, but I've been thinking about it. So what often happens is, yeah, I journal on this stuff. I also test ideas. So, whether that's in a blog or now like I write a weekly newsletter, is I'll often write around these topics. And what happens is you get feedback. You get to hear, maybe not from a bunch of people, but you get to hear from friends or family or people who read your newsletter or what have you, and they'll tell you like, hey, that really resonated, or this really resonated. And I'll do the same with social media. So if listeners, if they read the book, if you want to go back a couple of years, you'll probably see some of those concepts like tweeted out or out on Instagram, because what I'm doing is I'm essentially saying, hey, here's something it might not be fleshed out, but here's a thought I have, like, put it out in the world.
Yep.
See if anybody likes it, or if anybody says like, hey, that's some good thinking, but you might want to think about this.
Right.
And that can kind of help, shape the ideas. So absolutely. I think writing is just wrestling with these ideas in as many ways as possible. And some of that is publicly, but, I could sit here and show you my notebook as well as there's so much of wrestling with it privately too, where I'm just like crossing things out and, trying different, titles or organization or what have you before I get into it.
Yeah.
Yeah, great stuff, man. Levi, is that helping you as far as your writing?
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing. I'm kind of the person that will definitely paralysis by analysis. I'll overthink it, and I'll want to know all the information before I start something. But at the end of the day, I always finish with, you needed to just start. But maybe that's just part of my process to see, because when I do start to maybe put my mind towards something, I really jump all in with it. And so I'm kind of trying to be more picky with what I'm selling my soul to, if you will. And so be curious, just as to maybe some new ideas with other people or whatever that might be. But yeah, I mean, selfishly, it is for me how do I start this dang thing? So,
well, Steve, to jump then into, like Levi said, some of the meat and actually getting into the book, like we said, we do want to get into some of that. So again, I know you've done this 1,000 times, but for the listener who maybe isn't familiar yet with the book, how would you define toughness, that being one of the major themes, as you said, toughness and resilience? What is toughness, and maybe what isn't toughness?
Yeah, so I think here is, we often have, when you ask people what is toughness or being resilient, a particular image comes to mind, and it's often like the stoic, I'm going to put my head down and push through the pain or discomfort, ignore pain, ignore whatever emotions I'm feeling, and just like bust through it. And that can work for being tough, but what I have found and what the research, shows is that's like saying, here's a hammer and this tool will fix every one of your problems. And what I try and do is say, hey, wait a minute. What toughness really is about is experience any sort of discomfort or stress or fatigue or pain or anything that pushes you outside of your comfort zone or puts you in that uncertainty a little bit. And then figuring out how to navigate that situation to take wise or thoughtful action. And when we put it in kind of this decision-making framework, then I think that helps us a little bit more, because it's not just having that hammer. It's saying, okay, in these difficult moments, how do I navigate it so that I can come out on the other side and make a decision that aligns with, my values or who I am or my goals that I have, or puts me further along the lines of this progress I'm trying to make, instead of just saying, hey, bulldoze through whatever you're trying to do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So much, I think a lot of what I kind of took away from the book was, and really kind of in how to approach toughness, is really about perception. You mentioned kind of the perception of our circumstances and how that plays a role. And there's a quote I really liked, that tougher individuals perceive stressful situations as challenges instead of threats. And I'm curious. So as a coach, where I'm going with this is, how do you train and coach that? But specifically, when I read that, it strikes me as, when I think back on my athletic days, it seems like that's an easy thing to say when things are going well. But if I think back to the times when, I'm sure we've all been there, of, you've done all your training, but then when you get into competition, there's that something happens when nothing works, right? You're lost, and it's a scary, a very, uncomfortable position to be in, when it's like, quitting becomes easy at that point when nothing's working. And that's where I'm curious whether it's extreme fatigue or just performance is not going well. There's that downward spiral that can happen really quickly. And that's where it seems like this idea of perceiving that situation as a challenge rather than a threat. The threat response is the natural response. So is it a matter of just exposing athletes, or in some cases, if it's, trying to prepare our kids for the challenges of life, is it a matter of exposing and learning from that? Or how do you approach that? What are some ways that we can train that approach of perception towards that challenge versus threat?
Absolutely. It's one of the hardest things to do, right? It's the simple thing to understand. I say that and they're like, oh, of course, see things as a challenge. Great. And your attitude and awareness going into it absolutely matters. But it's a lot harder to, say that, or it's a lot harder to do it in that difficult moment when everything's going wrong or you're failing, than to just say, like, hey, see it as a challenge. So there's a couple things that I think are important. And especially this goes with parenting and teaching and coaching, but you have to create the right environment. So often what happens is we, sometimes unintentionally create an environment where we're pushing people to see it as a threat and pushing people to go towards quitting, because we've created this, if I don't succeed, then it's not, Andrew, you failed the math test. It's that Andrew is a failure at life, right? Or, Steve didn't lose the race. Steve is a loser. And the reason, we have to kind of get away from that. How do you get away from that? You create the right environment where failure is seen as, it's something that happens and might be a negative, but it's also an opportunity to grow. It's us as a coach or teacher or leader who, doesn't dive in immediately after the game and says, like, what's wrong with you? Like, what happened out there? Like, you sucked or you lost or what have you, because all that does is it ingrains, like, to that kid or that athlete, oh man, this is something that is negative that I shouldn't have done, and now I'm in trouble for it. And my parents, sometimes, like, it's like my parents don't support me anymore. So our environment plays a big role in allowing us to kind of have the freedom to, accept and take things on as a challenge.
Did you dig into how we can kind of create or shape our environment? And because some of those circumstances are uncontrollable. You're in elementary school, middle school, high school, maybe that's a little bit too early to start talking about some of these things, although the foundation can be built there. Talk a little bit about how you can foster a healthy environment to get through some of these tough things and build resilience.
Absolutely. So the research is pretty clear on this, and it's relatively simple, but again, difficult to do. But that environment, there's three big things. Is one, a sense of autonomy. So a sense that you have a voice and you can make choices and that you're have some semblance of control. It's not full control, right? But it's that to use the business example, that you are not micromanaged to death and feel like you can't do anything. So what happens is if we feel like we have no control, no autonomy, we tend to default towards apathy because it's like, why try? It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
So creating environments where, the students, the athletes, the kids feel like, hey, they have some sort of autonomy and freedom. The other thing that is really important is a sense of competency. So a sense that you can make progress and there is a path for you to get better and grow. So in the academic world, it's you can become better at algebra or whatever have you. We can improve on this. In the athletic sense, it's I can become a better athlete and I'm going to, in this environment. And as the coach, I'm going to support and teach you how to become a better athlete. And then the third thing that is really important in terms of environment is a sense of connection and belonging. So if you feel connected to the team, the classroom, your workplace, whatever it is, then what happens is you feel that connection, and then that creates a sense of security. In that sense that even if I have a bad day, yeah, my teammates might be a little upset, my coach might be a little upset, but we're in this together over the long haul, and we're trying to get better. And then it's not I'm going to be thrown under the bus, right? It's that we are here together and trying to move forward together. And that creates that community, that sense of connection, that sense of security that often allows you to take risks, calculated risks that allow you to essentially, to use the sports analogy, you start to play to win instead of playing not to lose.
Right. Yeah, that's huge. It's kind of like being proactive rather than reactive in a sense.
Exactly. And that's kind of what it is life often tells us to kind of be reactive. And when we get in survival situations, which are often those like fear of failure situations, we default towards being reactive. So what we want to do is teach and allow people to kind of get in that mindset where they're more proactive.
Yeah, that's one of the big
and
themes
how much of it
came across to me. Sorry, Levi. The idea of autonomy and choice, and how the presence of those leaves room for the individual to find a way to persist or to be tough, in your words. And there were two examples that stuck out that I'd like to kind of dig into a little bit. One being the Canadian coaches Dennison and Mills, the other being Steve Kerr, as he was coaching the Golden State Warriors. And all these coaches kind of experimented with that player-led coaching environment, giving the players some of the choice, back in practice in the training component, because they're the ones, on competition day, they are the ones making choices in the moment. So let's practice that and actually give them some autonomy there. I love that approach. It's something that we see mirrored a lot in higher ed right now, with a student-centered approach and giving some of that autonomy back to students. What I'm kind of curious about from that perspective is where are the boundaries, and what sorts of structure do you still need to put into? You don't want to just say, hey, go crazy. And, a lot of this might be age appropriate, and you're not going to give full autonomy of the school day to a 6-year-old versus someone in college. But, maybe can you talk about where that structure comes in a more autonomous role, with where it's a player-led or a coach or a student-led activity?
It really is about finding that, what I'd call that middle path. And a lot of that is dependent on who's sitting across from you, right? So my wife is a literacy specialist in elementary school. So she works with, those 6-year-olds essentially. And, I talk to her about this all the time. And where I, having often worked in the college setting, might give a longer leash and more decision-making, like she can't, as you said, just be like, hey, choose what you want to do, choose your own adventure, because it'll be chaos, right? But what she tries to do in those situations is give enough structure around it and then some choice in those moments. So for instance, in teaching, it's, they'll often have workshops where it's like, okay, we need to teach this skill, but then she'll give, even 6-year-olds, hey, you can demonstrate this skill in a number of ways. And here are 3 options, right? You can go write about it, or you can go record a video explaining how you would teach this to someone else, or, you can go whatever else it is, but you're giving a little bit of that constraint. Are you giving a lot of constraint, but enough autonomy where the student goes, oh, okay, I get to contribute to this. I get to say, I'm going to show my skill in writing a story about this or telling a story or whatever it is with that structure. And I think that's really important. So the way I kind of look at it is, as a leader or coach or boss or whatever, how do I set the appropriate constraints that gives them focus and gives them that goal and teaches the lesson? And then within those constraints, how do I give them choices so that they feel like they are participating actively in this learning and development process? And you do that and good things happen. And then, the example that you talked about in the book, which I think is great, is that Steve Kerr example, which is also, you got to know when to pull that autonomy card out. So the long story short on the Steve Kerr is Steve Kerr, coach of Golden State, multiple champions. One time he saw in the middle of the regular season, he saw his athletes, his team was kind of getting a little complacent and not listening to him as much. So what does he do for one game? He says, you know what, guys, you're going to be the coaches. You call the plays. You're in charge in the huddles. I'm going to step back. Now, we didn't do that for the rest of the season or during the, the playoff run. He was very intentional on saying, you know what, I'm going to give this autonomy to show the players that I trust them, to give them a different perspective, to maybe kind of get them out of that kind of funk that they're in. And it works. So sometimes it's about being very, going back to what we talked about at the beginning, deliberate and intentional on where you give that freedom and structure so that you get the best out of those you're working with.
Mm-hmm.
Not a coaching scenario here, but a parenting scenario. As a result of your book, that was one of the things I've kind of been experimenting with is where can I give? So I have a 6-year-old and a 1.5-year-old. And so where can I give my 6-year-old some additional autonomy when temper tantrums come up? That's, one of the things we're working on is behavior. And when he's losing it and going crazy, one of the things I've been experimenting with is asking or giving him the choice, do you want to reset or do you want me to help you reset? And giving him the space to kind of create that. And so I just wanted to say thank you for kind of introducing that idea. Hopefully, maybe I don't know if I'm sounding like a bad parent now. I hadn't figured that out already. But again, thank you. I think it's been a helpful tip that I've found successful with him. And again, gives him some of that choice in the matter instead of just a authoritarian beat him over the head with the rules of, hey, get in line. It's, how do you want to do this? Here's the goal. Like you said, identify the goal. The goal is calmer behavior and kind of figuring out the situation, rational emotional response rather than crazy 6-year-old, but allowing him to play a role in that as well. So thank you.
Well, speaking of that, and looking back and doing some of the research, I think that's a very interesting thought there, especially as it pertains to families. Did you see this type of approach in the past? Has this been done before? Like, because when I think of those that went through World War II, I don't imagine them being like, how do you feel today? And then we're, like almost allowing them to kind of work through some of that stuff. And maybe it's something more today, but I almost feel like some people overshoot it and give too much autonomy or too much freedom to youth who don't have those boundaries or don't have the foundation yet. So was this something common before that is coming back around as many things do? Or is this kind of a newer approach that we're realizing, wow, there's something to this?
Yeah. So the history on this is fascinating. And that, like everything in life, it ebbs and flows and comes and goes. So if you look at actually some of the research in parenting styles of, we'll call them indigenous tribes, right? Whether that's like Eskimo tribes in like Alaska and Canada, or tribes in Africa, or like indigenous in Mexico, is back in the like 1950s and 60s. There was a lot of brilliant parenting work where they just anthropologists would go observe these parents, and what they found is that these situations or these indigenous tribes often had kind of this golden middle ground of what we're talking about here, where it's like some constraints, but also a lot of freedom and autonomy in here. So it's something that is, the anthropologists often said, like, this is something that's been around for, probably, generations on generations on generations. And it works really well. And again, I don't remember all the research, but I remember in one of the studies on kids and parents in, I think it was Northern Canada, again, kind of like Eskimos, etc., is they found that one of the central teaching components was what they called equanimity, which is essentially how do you navigate these emotions and not like throw tantrums and kind of blow up, which is often what we see in our modern world. So to answer your question is, I think these ideas have been around for a long time, but in modern Western, civilizations, what happened is we often look towards like optimization and efficiency, which often, especially in that kind of World War II area, pushed us towards like, well, how do we get this done as efficiently as possible? Well, we become dictators. So we skewed too far in this one direction. And I think, to your point, because when we skew too far in one direction, what happens is you almost get the slingshot effect back. So some people are saying like, oh, never discipline, never, set high expectations. And you're saying, no, we went too far in the opposite direction when that happens, because then there are no constraints. And what we know is, based on the research, when there are no constraints, what that really means is it tells the kids there are no rules. There's no way to navigate this place. And it's like chaos, because think of it from, again, that 5-year-old's perspective is he or she is entering a world where they don't know the history of how things work. They don't know how they're expected to, behave or what have you. It's all new. So if there's no person kind of, teaching them, when we go into public places, we don't run and scream and yell all over the place. Or when like, strangers come over, this is how we greet them or what have you. So part of it is setting those expectations, those constraints, those almost rules for how to live life, while at the same time giving them some freedom so that they can, explore and often figure out kind of where these boundaries lie in their own world.
Yeah, and perhaps a lot of that has to do with our modeling, how we are showing them how to navigate these things and our relationships with our friends, family, new interactions that we have. And you realize really quickly as a parent about maybe some of those indigenous tribes, it was a lot of, let me show you how to do this. And so, there's elements of all that. It seems like, I guess, is where I'm going.
So yeah. One thing that I want to just comment on there that I think is important is I remember reading one of these studies, and I forgot what one it was, but it was again one of these indigenous tribes, and who had this is 1960s. They've been exposed to Western life, etc. And one of these parents from the indigenous tribes goes like, why do Western parents get so angry and yell at people all the time? Don't they know they're just teaching their child that this is the way you respond to things, is just get angry and yell? And I thought like, oh, this is a perfect example of modeling, is that we're modeling, oh, when things don't go our way, we freak out. And of course the child says, oh, this is how we act when we don't get our way. So we forget that behavioral modeling, which is so important, is we want to show, this is how you function and this is how you handle things. And I often think about this in youth sports, because, you go to youth athletic or youth sports games, and if the parent is yelling at the ref at, the 7-year-old peewee football game, well, the kid learns very quickly. It's like, oh, this is how I handle, a bad call, or when, something doesn't go my way, so I'm going to freak out. And then they wonder, years later when that kid is in high school, why is he cursing out the ref or what have you? And it's like, well, that's what was modeled. So there you go.
And yeah, that's what you're talking about with Bandura's work in the behavior change model, where it's like you kind of are who you're around. And I think if I remember correctly in that study or that experiment, he had like like a blow up doll or something like that. And there was parents that kind of treated it well or didn't do anything to it. And the kids didn't do anything. And then I think the parents started hitting it. And so then the kids started hitting it. And it was just a big reminder for me of, man, and I know I already said this, but they are watching you. And that's also, and if you don't have kids, that's coaches, that's friends, that's family members, and all the above. So just be mindful that even though we might be, some of us out there might be concerned that Big Brother's watching us. Well, don't worry about Big Brother. There's big community and those around you, and you're always being watched. So it's important to be, at the very least, be mindful of that, and someone's watching. So
I think that's spot on. And maybe to put the research behind that is, in the book I talk about, this was one of my favorite studies to look at, but they looked at coaching in the NBA.
Mm-hmm.
And they looked at coaches who had more of that like abusive yelling style that we're talking about. And they looked at, well, what happened to these players? Well, they found that, when you were coached by an abusive kind of coaching style, your performance declined. And then more importantly, or not more importantly, but more interestingly, your number of aggressive or technical fouls went up. And that went up for the rest of your career, even when you were gone from that coach. So you want to talk about modeling. Well, if you see your coach like losing it all the time, well, you start to adopt that more aggressive style or that aggression and losing it, which is often what leads to, some of these technical fouls or what have you. So again, another great example of people are watching, like what you're modeling, people are going to adopt and ingrain. So be very mindful and aware of it.
So what's the escape out of that? I mean, coaches are very influential, parents are very influential, teachers, and those that we're watching as we come up. But if someone's hearing this that may be more inclined towards that way, are there strategies to begin kind of changing behavior in that sense?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is, step one is that awareness.
Sure.
If you're aware of it, then you can actually actively do something about it. And then step two, I think, is often if you find yourself and you're saying, hey, this is me as the coach, as the parent, as the leader, and I know I do it, but changing habits is very hard. And often what happens is people do that because it's the model they learned. So they had a coach or a parent or a teacher who modeled this. So it's often the only way they know how to do it. One of the best things that you can do is go find or read or research, but most importantly, find mentors or others who do it the other way. So if you grew up idolizing, Bobby Knight in basketball, well, go watch Steve Kerr coach a lot, or go find the high school coach who is known as being, he might be a little tough, but supportive and growing individuals. Like, go ask if you can watch a practice, or as a teacher, go try and shadow someone who does it in a different skill set or a different way. And often that will give you some of that modeling where you're like, okay, this is how this other model is applied. And then just start slowly taking some of those things that you're observing or learning about and trying and testing those. And over time, you can often change your behavior.
Steve, it seems like, you mentioned kind of the 3 steps of the self-determination theory, and kind of getting into the second piece of that of giving people the chance to make progress and improve. It seems to me that, very much like the title of the book, Do Hard Things, exposing our kids to doing hard things is a practice that, if done correctly, will give them tremendous advantages, I believe, kind of over the average. And I'm curious, how do we determine the correct level of challenge? Is that challenges that are within reach so they can be successful, or challenges that are just out of reach so that maybe they can fail with a support system in place? How do you view that?
Yeah.
What's the research on that?
So I think what the research and how I view it is, I'm going to give you the cop-out answer, which is it's a little bit of both. Is you want to, if you look at the appropriate challenge, I'll use the athletic analogy. Most of your workouts should be, within your reach, right? If I'm going to the gym and I'm lifting weights, I want to see, I want to keep going back consistently. So I'm going to do something. I'm going to lift a heavy weight, but it is one where I can do it. But every once in a while, you want to test where you're at. you want to push beyond maybe what you're comfortable doing and saying, hey, am I capable of lifting this heavier bar? And you're going to fail some. I think the same thing goes with the challenges in our life, is that that often, we need to do things that are just on the bound, and then occasionally just over that bound of what we're capable of, where we might, quote unquote, fail. Because it's only when we're in those situations, when we feel that maybe that alarm that is telling us, I'm not good enough, or I'm an imposter, or you should quit. It's only when we experience that we learn how to navigate and deal with it. Because if we never go there, then everything is scary, right?
Mhm.
If we never push our bounds, if we never put ourselves in situations that create a little bit of anxiety or discomfort, then our brain literally learns to keep that alarm super high because it's never been put in that situation. And I think, we were talking about that nuance is in parenting. This is often that nuanced place where sometimes we get way too protective. And if we get way too protective, then we're never training our kids, alarm systems to get used to and processing that
Yeah.
anxiety or that discomfort or that sense of failure. Um, and often, the way I like to look at this, athletically, especially with young kids, is when you watch your kid or the athlete you're working with, lose a game, how do they handle that? And
Mhm.
if they immediately, default to freak out, this is the worst moment, or shut down, that tells you probably that they haven't experienced failure enough to understand how to deal with it appropriately.
Yep.
That's a great barometer. It seems like like a lot of this book is kind of the perception and kind of how are you viewing this, and so that seems to be perhaps, correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the big keys there following that failure is having that conversation to say, what did you learn, obviously, but I'm curious, what are the questions that you're asking after a failure? How do you get that kind of self-reflection to take place in a productive manner?
Yeah. So step one is, I call it, get out of stress mode, because often you can't have that conversation
Yeah.
when their mind is like, spiraling
Unclear.
out of control. Yeah, they're not clear. So
Mhm.
for
Mhm.
me, it is before I have this conversation, and this is where I think we often make a mistake. We just jump in and like, hey, here's what you need to learn, and how do you learn from this? And what happens is that kid just shuts down because he's like, dude, I feel miserable. I don't want to talk about what I need to learn. Like, go away, mom or dad or
Mhm.
coach or what have you. So
Yeah.
instead, it's like, how do I get them out of the stress mode? And for me, I'll give you the athletic sense is like, well, one of the best things I can do is like not talk about the game initially, but say like, hey, go hang out with your friends, or like go eat the popsicle or the orange
Mhm.
after the game. And what happens is they hang out with their friends, they commiserate a little bit, but then because they're hanging out with their teammates and people they enjoy, it takes them out of stress mode, right?
Yeah.
And then you're able to have that conversation and ask those questions. And again, I would frame it as, how do I have this productive conversation without pushing them into defense and protect mode? So for me, it's just being curious. It's being like, hey, what did you think about that? Like,
Yeah.
well, what do we think, looking forward? Like, okay, that's what you think. What do we take into the next game? Or what can you learn from this? Or, what maybe would you change next go around? And you're just kind of being inquisitive and curious without pushing and prodding them to kind of go down that path.
Yeah, it
It's
seems
such
like
a
the difference between like asking questions and having some wonderment versus interrogating and almost attacking. Like because they're both the same thing. Both of them end with a question mark, but the intensity of which the question is and the intent behind it is definitely different when you're thinking about like that wonderment. Like, what do you think about that? Rather than why did you do that or whatever. Those are kind of the same thing, but very different at the same time.
Exactly. It really is. It really is your approach. And I think after losses or failures, we're almost, I like to think of it as we're in this sensitive period where we can either, if we interrogate, we're just going to cause them to shut down. But if we're curious and have that wonderment, then we can often, have that conversation. And the other thing that is important is you as the coach, parent, whoever, leader, teacher, often can model this as well in even how you're discussing it, because I can take something that maybe they think is a failure, but be like, you know what? Like, did you see how you really you did this really well, even though it was a difficult moment? Like, I noticed that, after you missed that shot or you struck out or what have you, you stayed really composed. Like, how did you stay composed out there? And you're reinforcing that the thing is, how you respond to it. It's not that you quote unquote failed or what have you.
Now, how much of this for you is like, is this just an aha thing that you all of a sudden developed this skill, or was it other people that asked you these questions? Did you develop that skill of wonderment and curiosity with your athletes and those around you?
Yeah, so I think a lot of it is it's a mixture of everything. For me, it comes down to what we talked about earlier, which is observing and paying attention and being intentional on things. So I would notice when my athletes, when I jumped right in, maybe after a competition or a race or what have you, and I said, hey, do this, this, and this, or what went wrong here, here, and here, you could see their eyes would glaze over, and it was like, there's nothing going on. There's no learning going on.
Over it.
So, I'm over it. So I have to try different approaches to see how can I connect and get the message across, because it's not about me. It's about how do I get that message across or put them in a positive, productive manner. So, and then the other thing is you watch good people. If I'm at a game or a track meet or what have you, is I would watch other coaches who I respect. I'd be like, well, I just saw one of their athletes maybe perform poorly. What are they going to do? And you don't have to be right there, but you observe, you see the coach who comes in and just, gives a pat on the back or whatever have you. And you see those kind of keys and indicators and you're like, okay, that's the tool I need to develop as a coach. So watching others is highly important. And even I would say, this is why I love coaching, and it translates, I think, to teaching as well. Is, if you're at a professional game, you go to a baseball game or a football game, like, don't just watch on the field, like, watch what's going on the sideline, like, see what the coaches do, and then importantly, like, see how the player responds. Like, after that football game, after someone fumbles, if the coach yells and gets in the face, like, what is the body language of that player afterwards? Like, is it good or bad? And it might differ for every player, but it again, that watching and observing often gives you some cues for how you can do this better.
To me, it makes me think of that's a great opportunity to give that autonomy too, is instead of saying, oh, you did this wrong, here's what you do to fix it. It's saying, hey, how would you fix it? And oftentimes I think, in many cases, depending on age and proficiency, that answer is probably in there somewhere. And, we constantly, I at least constantly overanalyze failures and what could I have done better. So I love that approach of providing the question and the framework to say, okay, figure this out. Let's do it together with a mentor or a coach and figure out what are the steps I could take to do that better the next time, rather than hammering them over the head with that advice. And I think that kind of piggybacks into one of the questions I have. You've mentioned the importance of mentors. I'm curious, who are some of your biggest mentors and how did you find them? I think finding them especially, that's one of the things that I'm always curious how people created those connections and trying to kind of take away, again, selfishly take away some tips for how do we find mentors ourselves?
Yeah. So I'm fortunate. I have a lot of great mentors. Again, many of them coaches and some writers and other things in my field, but people like, a former track coach, Tom Tellez or Vern Gambetta, or my high school track coach, Gerald Stewart, and and a bunch of other people as well. Dave Epstein's been a great mentor in writing. In some of them you're in the right place at the right time, but what I found more so is that if people see that you're passionate and that you care and that you're interested in wanting to get better and you're kind of doing interesting things, what happens is people will want to help you out.
Yeah.
And that's been kind of my MO for how I've hopefully helped mentor people. Is I see someone young and, you know, they're interested in this stuff, or even if they're not young, they're just like really, you know, excited about something, and that enthusiasm, you know, I see it and I'm like, you know what, maybe it's just a conversation. I'm like, you know what, I can help this person out. Or yeah, or I'll just tell them, you know, if you have any questions, here's my contact info, glad to help you out, even on a small scale, because you catch that enthusiasm. So if you're looking for mentors, I think we often go about it almost the wrong way, in the sense that I'm going to go like network and this is how I'm going to do things. But to me, it's like, you know, be passionate, be interesting. And often your mentors, you know, some of the people I mentioned are like high level and famous, but others were literally high school coaches or teachers who, you know, off the street, no one else would know, but they were super important mentors to me because they provided value and perspective. So don't just think like I need a mentor with a name of someone who's accomplished X, Y, and Z. Like you can learn a lot of different things from a lot of different people. So be open to being mentored.
Becoming the person that is, you know, basically it's be coachable. It sounds like is a great way to start that, which requires action, right? It's not something that we can passively do and expect anyone to come along and fix that. Yeah, that's great advice. Steve, I'm curious, do you have any daily habits or things that you feel have profoundly kind of helped you get to where you are or maintain where you are, perhaps?
Yeah, so I think a couple that are really important are, as I mentioned before, exercise. I'm no longer trying to compete or anything like that, but having some sort of daily exercise or getting out and move is really important for me. Other things that habits or what have you is I really prioritize sleep. So I try and, you know, this all isn't always the case, but I try and get sleep as much as I can. Because I think it's important for making sure I wake up feeling energized, all that good stuff as well. The other thing that I really think is important, and this goes with exercise, but also not, is like spending time outside in nature. Is I really try, and whether that's going on walks with my wife or taking the dog for a walk or just, you know, sometimes when the weather is nice, going out and reading a book on a bench or whatever have you, you know, is spending time outside in nature is a really important thing for me to do, especially since I spend a lot of time in front of a computer screen writing. So getting away from that as well. And then the last, I'll call it a habit, but is being very intentional and deliberate on my social media use. I think it can be, as we talked about, very good, but I also am a human being, so I can get lost in scrolling and, you know, watching way too many YouTube videos or what have you. So I just try and be intentional about it, you know?
I love that. Levi, I know you have a comment on that.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Well, I don't even want to go down that road because it's going to get dark really quick. Actually is so we're right so far. It seems like we've talked about the solo journey independently, and then also how we can mentor others. What about when things, I mean, I think from a coach's perspective, I'm not saying it's easy, but maybe it's easier as a coach bringing along athletes, or as a mentor bringing along those that want to come with you. Do you have advice for sharing this with your spouse, sharing this with your kid? How do you encourage someone else to want to do hard things when that might not be everyone? And maybe deep down it is everyone, but not everyone at the same time that you want to do hard things. So I guess, what is a way to bring along some of those more intimate relationships that you live next to that person and you live in the house? That's a lot different than meeting up at the track or the baseball field or whatever sport you're coaching or playing. So how do you navigate that?
Yeah, that's probably one of the most difficult things to do. The closer the connection, it's ironically often harder to do than with someone you don't know as well. So to me, it really is about creating that. Well, let me step back. the closer they are, the more, if you push, they are going to resist.
Yep.
So you could never force anybody to do anything. So I'm very intentional about that and aware of that, to like, no matter how great I think this might be, I can't force my spouse or anyone else to do these things. So what it comes down to me is like, I want to know what they're interested in and excited about and where they kind of like to be challenged. And then I'm going to do my best to support them in that area. Right. Where I'm saying, you know what, with my wife, like she wants to take on more random projects in her school that she really enjoys. I'm going to say, go for it. Because like, if this is what challenges you in these moments, then great. And then the other thing that is important, I think, is just inviting people in without expectations.
Yeah.
So if your spouse or significant other or child, invite them to go on walks or go for a run or a bike ride. But if they say no, don't be like, oh, why don't you want to come do this with me? Be like,
yeah,
it's totally fine. Like, I'm just going to go enjoy this. But like, I'd love to have you just like invite them into these spaces that you think are important. And often if we do that, eventually they'll come along, or, especially with kids, it's like, they'll see that like, oh, mom and dad really value this. And like, they get excited about this stuff, especially younger ones. And the younger we can kind of get them excited about things, the better off it often is. And the last thing I'd say is, as well as, let them do it on their own kind of, it's like in their own way.
Yep.
Like, I think often with kids is we try and force them the adult version of the thing. But like, if spending time in nature means like going and standing around and picking up, pine cones and throwing them, then like, whatever, like the kid loves that. Like, we'll do that a little bit instead of, walking the dog or whatever it is. Like, invite them into it in a way that is appropriate and that they resonate with.
I love that.
Yeah.
Levi, do you have other questions that you've got for Steve?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like at this point I'd be kind of bouncing around a little bit, but there was a couple things that really stood out, and I think a lot of this intentionality, and maybe this is a bit of a stretch, but I was really intrigued by the interoception concept that you talked about. Can you kind of share a little bit about that, and maybe give an elevator speech of what that is and how we can kind of use that and apply that in our lives?
Absolutely. This is one of my most fascinating research that I came across, which essentially is that interoception is how well you can read your body's internal signals.
Yeah.
And what scientists have found is the better we're able to read those signals, the better we're able to navigate feelings, emotions, all of that good stuff. The kind of quick answer to this, I'll give the athletic and then the kid kind of analogy, is that in athletics, you had to learn early on. You didn't know the difference between maybe pain that meant I'm injured or pain that meant like, hey, I'm just sore. Like, I can continue on this. Right. And you had to spend the time to distinguish and understand, oh, this isn't the end of the world. My leg isn't going to fall off because it's a little sore because I lifted weights. Like, I'm okay. You had to discern that. And the same thing goes with, the kid example I like to give is, going back to, 5 and 6 year olds, is my wife taught me this, is that, you ask a kid who's throwing a tantrum what's wrong, and they'll often tell you the same thing as like, oh, I feel sad. And all they know how to do is describe it as sad because they're not adults. Then they don't have that diversity of understanding their emotional experiences, where that sadness could be frustration or loneliness or, whatever it is, all sorts of these other descriptors. So everything gets lumped together. And when everything's lumped together, we can't deal with it. Right. I know how to deal with loneliness. I go call a friend or go out to eat. Sadness is just too jump together. So that's what this kind of interoception is spending time, in these kind of different feeling or emotional states, and then trying to, slice and dice it apart and add some nuance to it so that you understand the signals that your body is sending.
Yeah, and I found the most breakthrough with that for me as a parent, and maybe I'm off, I don't know, but when my kid is frustrated, to just sit there with them, and it's not the time to coach, teach, parent, or otherwise. It's just kind of sitting there, and you can visibly see this. And I think to figure out what's happening inside, and they're working through some of that. So because that is a very mature idea to, and which for me was the bigger picture of this book, was you don't have to go and look for hard things. They're already every day in your life. And in fact, in order to go and do those hard things, we need to sit in those more challenging and difficult experiences that we have and wrestle with inside of us. It's not facing the lion and climbing the mountain. It's just dealing with our own emotions. But if we can do that internally and have this interoception and understand these signals that are being given to us, we can then go and climb the mountain and fight the tiger, because we have the skills to do that. And then more specifically, again, with kids, is just kind of sitting in that and allowing them to kind of process that, and just being available to answer questions, or just being there is kind of half the battle, I'm noticing. And then, that will certainly change as they get older and mature and these other things. But I was really too, as you were interested in this idea of interoception, was just that, like, both for me as an individual, and then how do I give that skill to my kids as well?
Levi, I'm going to have to steal that from you, because I think you just gave the best summary of the book that I've heard.
There you go.
Because it really is, as we often think of the hard things as the lion in the mountain. But the reality is, if we can do the small, challenging things that we're faced with, that develops those skills. And often the best way is just kind of sit with it and experience it, and instead of avoiding it or pushing it away. Because if we sit with it and experience it, just like you gave the example there with kids, is like, you'll figure it out. Like, you're going to figure out how to process and navigate it. And too often we try and jump in, avoid, or push away, or solve, so that we don't have to experience that discomfort instead of learning from it.
Well, and to be fair, I think the heart is that we're doing these other things to try to figure out the answer, when we have, and this is what I'm learning from your book, is we already have the answer, but we have to kind of wait around to find it. It's not always seeking it from someone else. We're given these tools, but sometimes those tools need to be sharpened, or it's just a piece of steel, but we have to hammer it, fold it, heat it, hammer it, fold it, heat it. And like, we have to refine how we can deal with some of these things. And I really do believe those tools are there, but sometimes we need the mentors to grab the hammer when our grip strength is fatigued, or when the fire is too hot. We need others to help. And this is where that kind of community, the team, the collaborative experience is so beneficial for us. And then also, again, having those mentors and our spouse and close friends that can help us work through those things. But ultimately, we still have to do the work. It doesn't matter how good of advice we get, how good of books we read. We have to figure that out, and only we can do it. But we're hoping to bring others around us that can help us kind of highlight or maybe shorten the time frame it takes to figure out how to figure it out almost.
Absolutely. I love it. I agree 100%. As I said, that's a brilliant summary, and I agree, and it's spot on.
It also strikes me as I listen to that, Levi, that we've talked about the importance of exercise, the importance of writing. These are two disciplines that oftentimes we can try to distract and provide, whether it's you're listening to music or you're doing other things to kind of numb that interoception. And I think those are two disciplines that are amazing at allowing us to sit in some uncomfortability at times and figure out, what are my responses to this? So, man, that's one thing that I need to maybe do a better job of, is not try to numb the discomfort, but sit in that discomfort and see what I can get out of that. Because I think there's probably some good lessons to be had in those moments that oftentimes we're kind of just, I want to ignore that and push it away. And like you said in your book so many times, Steve, don't push it away, accept it, identify it, name it, and then figure out how to approach that better the next time.
Spot on.
Yeah.
Levi,
Yeah.
anything else before we wrap up?
Well, like I said, I could go all day long here. I mean, this is just such an interesting topic and so important, both for me as an individual, for things that I want to impart on my kids and those that I come across. But I mean, I can't thank you enough. And being in motivation to, number one, run a little bit, always hesitant to do, more specifically long distances, and then number two, to get into writing, and that is definitely, as Andrew and both you, Steve, have mentioned, that is a great tool to be introspective and to kind of wrestle with the uncomfortable stuff. And again, something that Andrew and I always say is just start, and I need to take some of my own advice in that way and just start writing and not be worried about the audience or who cares or is it important or whatever. I need to remember that it has nothing to do with anyone else. It's for me, like selfishly, it's for me to kind of get some of that out. And if it helps someone else, great. But at the very least, it's helping me. So I guess I could be selfish in that way.
Love it. No, thanks so much, guys. I appreciate that. And I think there's always room to learn and grow. And I've got some notes from this conversation on things I'm going to do differently as well. That's
amazing. Well, everyone, do hard things by Steve Magness. It's as you can tell, hopefully this is a great book that provides a lot of additional thoughts and challenges for us to be thinking about and approaches to many different aspects of life. So Steve, thank you for the work that you put in to write this book. And thank you so much for the time that you spent with us. We certainly appreciate the lessons that you're able to share with us. So just as a last little handoff to you, where can our listeners learn more about you or find you, whether that be social media or otherwise?
Yeah, so you can find me on social media, Twitter, Instagram, all those at Steve Magness. And then you can get my book wherever books are sold and find most of my work at stevemagness.com.
And then also a couple of those episodes and some good stuff there too.
Thanks. I appreciate it.
Indeed. Well, thanks everybody. Go buy the book. We really enjoyed it and got a lot out of it. And Steve, again, thanks so much for your time.